Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hogan 360 presented by DTech. We're just going to give a couple of minutes more for people to join. I understand some were having some technical difficulties in terms of being able to join the meeting. We should be able to get that through relatively quickly. So if you can just kind of bear with us for about a minute or so, and we'll start momentarily. Again, thanks to everybody for joining today's Hogan 360, again presented by DTech. We're just going to start at 2 minutes past the hour, and we'll get going. We appreciate everybody joining early, or joining on time, actually. Just a couple of things while we're still waiting for people to join. If you have any questions, please enter them into the question and answer pod, and we'll be happy to ask your questions as the slides are presented. Don't hold back. If you've got any questions or comments, I'm sure I'd love to be able to present them to Anica. Again, we'd like to kind of keep this more of a conversation. Although you're muted, please go ahead and ask those questions in the question and answer portal, and I'll be sure to present them to Anica as they come back. So now, moving forward, it looks like we've got a number of attendees on, and again, thank you very much for joining us on this Tuesday morning. We will be presenting the Hogan 360 to you, obviously presented again by DTech. I'm your moderator for the day, as well as Director of Sales at DTech. My name is Jag Nidger, as well as I've got Anica Zarac on the line, and she is our business psychologist here at DTech, our resident expert in everything Hogan, as well as many, many other items. So again, in the spirit of staying on time or getting pretty close to it, thank you for joining. Any question and answers, please ask in the question and answers pod, and I'll turn it over to Anica, our business psychologist, to start the webinar.
Thank you, Dag, and good morning to everyone. So today, what we have for you is a little bit of a hybrid between product demonstration and talking about the Hogan 360, getting you to know what the tool is about, what it looks like, how you can use it, but I have a hybrid between presenting you the Hogan 360 and having a more general conversation about best practices in 360 assessments, right? So we'll start off with using a 360 exercise: when, why, how, figuring out, when to use it, when not to use it, what are the best practices in terms of usage. Then we'll move on to presenting you the Hogan 360 and additional resources that you can use along when you do use the 360. And finally, we'll conclude on best practices for impactful feedback, how to deliver, and key pointers with respect to that. And there are nice resources that already exist guiding you to your feedback. And finally, we'll have a question and answer period, but all through the webinar, we encourage you to send your questions so that we can answer them. So starting with why use a 360 exercise assessment tool. First of all, they're highly predictive, right? So just getting feedback from one person can obviously be helpful, but the 360 is really powerful because you're getting an aggregate evaluation from various people in your surrounding. And when we look at those aggregate scores, that's when we're really predicting performance, right? We're getting really, obviously 360 exercises are about perceptions, but when we look at those aggregate scores, we tend to be able to predict performance quite well in different variables such as employee satisfaction, engagement for leadership roles, sales, and different performance variables. What's interesting is some authors have pointed out, Zenger and Folkman, that self-ratings are the least reliable and predictive of performance. And this is really an interesting information, and we often see it where self-ratings are, much higher than all the other ratings, or vice versa. People that rate themselves much more harshly than others do. So that, as much as, people can be self-aware, we often see through the 360 that how one sees themselves is not always related to how others, how others. So it can be a really enlightening experience, especially since we know that self-awareness is so key to leadership development, right? So for a leader to be able to grow and develop, they have to be self-aware, right? What do I need to develop? What are my strengths, right? And having that, that assessment done can be a great reality check in terms of where they're at currently. So 360 feedback can be a really powerful exercise that's even career changing. We've seen examples of people, getting really hard feedback, but then changing things around and working very hard and having this as kind of a milestone in their career where they've received the feedback and they've really been able to act upon it, right? So it can be very powerful when done correctly, right? So there are also stories about 360s not being done with the best practices, and this is where it's really important because receiving feedback from your peers, from your employees can be very, very helpful and powerful when done correctly. So we do want to have this constructive approach to it, and knowing the best practices are really important. When do we use a 360 feedback exercise? And based on my work with different clients, this really is a tool that is meant for develop initiatives, develop cohorts, programs in terms of getting leaders having a self-awareness exercise as part of a program or a personal initiative. Even if they're not part of a cohort. What we want to, when not to use it, I should say, is when we want to have proof that, the person is not doing a good job, and we kind of want, having a documented, proven, written record that will help us get a person closer out the door, right? And I've seen, clients having really past bad experiences where, they've burnt a good tool using the wrong, using a good tool in the wrong context, right? So that you want to be using this to help people grow, help people develop. If they are struggling, this is not, our proof that will help us get them out the door, but rather a tool that can help us attempt at help them grow, fix whatever needs to be fixed if it can. And this is really the way we want to use it, because when it's used in another way, people around the organization see what's happening, and this is where you get people being concerned and worried about doing the tool, right? So we do want to use it constructively, and I've advised against this context many times to clients that want to use it, and this context that would not be the conditions of success. When not to use it also is when the person hasn't been in the role long enough, right? So it's very important that we give the chance to the person to kind of reach, a cruising speed in their role, to be able to have people around them know them well in this role so that they can best assess them the most accurate way. Also, it'd be important not to use the 360 if there's a specific organizational crisis where we'd have people rating more the context rather than the individual. So those are watch outs when you would not want to use 360. And basically, you want to use it when the person is either helping them grow because they're high potential, because they're struggling, but in a development effort.
I just got a question come in. Sure. Sorry to interrupt. You remarked about having somebody in a specific role for a set amount of time before you roll out a 360. Is there a rule of thumb in terms of how long somebody's been in the role? What is kind of the measurement that should be used in that case?
Yeah. So I've seen various, it has to be at least several months. So that I would say that I would, the one that sticks to my mind the most is, a minimum of 6 months, right? So giving them enough time to be known, and because what you want to avoid is unconscious biases, right? And the bias that can happen if the person is not known enough is that first impression, right? So that you don't want it to be just about, unfounded first impressions, but really giving enough sample of behaviors to people in their environment to rate them as accurately as possible. And the same would go even if the person is in the role, for 2-3 years, you wouldn't want someone that has known the person only 2 months, for instance, to rate them, right? So that you'd want them to know them for, enough time. Again, I'm going back towards the 6 months to know them enough so that they can best assess.
Thank you.
Any other question before we move on to our how?
That's it for right now.
Perfect. So if we go with how, so best practices is just ensure conditions of success. And this I've seen over and over again where, clients sometimes want to speed things up and want to get, the project done in a certain deadline. And you really gain from making sure that everyone's clear about what are the exercises objectives, the purpose of doing the 360 exercise, getting people, it's not on the slide here, but being clear about what the process will be so that people know why we're doing this and how it will be done, and there are no surprises. So that sometimes we see people kind of showing up and they're not quite clear about, why they're doing this. And obviously you're not going to have the same impact with the exercise if that's not clear. And being, clear, again, receiving feedback, I've said it in other talks. There's one author that, I've loved how they've turned this. They compare to receiving feedback to walking in a dark alley at night and hearing footsteps, right? So it can be very threatening, and it is a social threat, right? And it's important to put it into context in terms of reassuring people about how this will be used constructively, that we're creating a feedback culture that will help people grow. And, I really invite people to use a growth mindset, and all of Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset and having people see feedback, as not something of a proof that I'm not good at something, but that it allows me to grow, and it allows me, this feedback is allowing me to get information that allows me to improve and see, even though something's not natural, if I invest efforts, I can develop this, right? And I've gotten great successes from setting the table with a growth mindset, analogies, and setting the table and just getting the feedback receiver into growth mindset mode. Really important also as a best practice, being clear about confidentiality, who will receive the results, and minimizing that to exactly who needs to be receiving the results, and making sure that the results are confidential, but that the responders remain anonymous, right? So that we can't link who said what, and that remaining anonymous is really key so that people feel comfortable answering in a transparent way to give real feedback without fear that their response can be traced back, right? So ensuring that confidentiality, anonymity is really respected, and we're clear about how this will be respected to participants. Keeping it short and simple. So 360 exercises sometimes can be, quite time consuming, especially when cohorts are doing them, where, recently we did an entire team where we can see how colleagues are responding to not only one 360, right? So it's important to keep the exercise short, keeping the questions relevant, right? So we should be aiming at, maximum 15, 20 minutes to answer a questionnaire. Focus on what's relevant to the participant's role using a balanced approach, right? So using a balanced approach means focusing, yes, on areas of improvement, but also focusing on strengths. and I keep on repeating it, strengths are key to performance, right? So that what makes us perform are strengths, and we can predict people's performance based on whether or not they're using their strengths, their talents in their role, right? When we ask people, you know, are you using your strengths in your role, people who say yes perform better than people who say no. It's very straightforward and simple, but very powerful. So helping people understand what are their strengths, how they can leverage them is really key. So we want to focus on this. Finally, I've said it and I'm repeating it. We're using this for development purposes. And since we're using this for development purposes, the 360 in itself is only a means to a development end, right? So what's more important than what came out of the 360 is what the person will do and those action steps, right? So this is just a tool leading to action steps, and the action steps are really what's most important. All right, so now that we've reviewed some best practices in terms of why, when, how, we'd be ready to present you the Hogan 360. Before I start, Jag, any other questions before we move on? All right. Jag, I can't hear you, but I think
yes, sorry about that. I was muted, but no, not at this point.
All right, good. Perfect. So really excited to show you the Hogan 360. And again, you know, Hogan not disappointing with this great tool that is really great to use. And the way they've structured the Hogan 360 is really interesting. You know, when we look at it, there's really 6 main parts to the report, and it really leads to great conversation. The report starts off with the overall item ratings, right? So based on there are 14 different competencies that are assessed in this assessment via 50 items, and it kind of starts off with a list of the items. And what you want to do here when you present this results, the results on the item ratings, is not get bogged down in details. And that's one of the biggest danger with 360s, is getting overly caught up with the details. What you want to do is recognize patterns, right? So this is a great way of starting to identify patterns based on, you know, the responders' scores. And here what you want to do is zoom in on the top ranks and the bottom ranks, right? So what's really coming out in terms of what's been ranked best for you, you know? So Hogan 360 recommends that you focus on the top 10, the bottom 10. You know, I would say go with, you know, what makes sense also. Sometimes, you know, the top 5 really makes sense. You know, you'll see that there is a cluster, there a certain theme or certain themes that are emerging. So a great way of doing this in the feedback is allowing the person kind of introducing this, explaining that these are the item rankings, and asking them to read the top 10, the bottom 10, asking them what themes, what takeaways are they seeing, right? So what are, you know, repeated themes that they're seeing across these top bottom scores. And what's interesting also is that you see the person's rank, you know, their score on the item, and then we're comparing them to a benchmark, a global average score. We'll see later with Jag that you can even add a organizational benchmark that you can include there. So, you know, what's interesting about this candidate, for instance, if we look at their bottom score, you know, even their bottom score are higher than the global average, right? So this is a message that we can see that, you know, they seem to be quite strong overall, and on even the lower rankings, they're quite strong. So this is a great way to start thinking about what themes are emerging, what seems to be most salient in their results. Next, we'll move to the competencies. So there are different versions of the Hogan 360, and we'll talk about this shortly, but this is the general one, the main version. And there are 14 leadership competencies within a leadership model, right? And we see that it divides nicely in terms of self-management, relationship management, working in the business, which are competencies that are more operational, if you will, and working on the business, which are more strategic competencies, if you will. So then you have your 14 competencies in this leadership model. And then sometimes it's interesting to see where, you know, they're stronger in a certain quadrant or a certain part of the model, and it can be very well divided, and it illustrates clearly where the trends are. Because as you walk through this entire report, what you want to be noticing with your participant are what are the salient trends that are coming out. And then you have on each competencies the different scores. So here's just an example at the bottom of the screen of the self-management piece, and we have integrity, resilience. So here, you know, we have, you know, an incident where we notice, and it's not quite salient, but we do see it a little bit here, particularly for resilience, where the manager's scoring is, you know, lower than everyone else, right? So again, what's great about a 360 is that it's about perception. Right, so perception, so, you know, we're not debating, you know, who the real person is. We're just looking at perceptions at a specific point in time. And shortly, I'll compare, you know, the 360 exercise to personality and when to use both together, when to use one versus the other. But when we look at 360, it's really about perceptions at a specific point of time. And those perceptions can differ from depending on where you're standing, right? So, you know, if I give an analogy of a mountain, right? So, you know, you could be on the south side of the mountain and you kind of see, you know, one perspective, versus if you're on the north side of the mountain, you're still seeing the same mountain, but where you're standing, you're seeing a different picture, right? So that it's not who has the real, you know, view of the mountain. The real view of the mountain depends on, you know, all these different perceptions, right? So that there is no specific, we're not at the what's real, but from different standpoints, what are the perceptions? We're always talking about perceptions here. All right, so here we see that the perception of the manager is lower. So we could explore, you know, why would that be? You know, because we're seeing the direct reports giving particularly a strong score, right? And overall, it's quite strong also. So what are they seeing? What are the direct reports seeing versus the manager? And how can we explain this gap? Would be interesting to explore. Then we move on, and again with this idea of...
I'm sorry, Anica, just 1 second. I had a question come in, and I'll actually go ahead and ask the question and answer it as well. I'll give you a chance to rest your voice. The question was, are we able to select who should be the folks providing the feedback, or will it be the candidate who selects, and how many can they select? The answer to this question is actually very simple. We can do it either way. We can identify the subject and send them a portal or a link to be able to select their own raters, but we can also have you know, the individual that is running the program upload the raters themselves for any particular subject. In terms of how many in total, the number is 20, and that 20 can be made up of 5 different groups. So, you know, some of the standard is manager, peer, direct report, and self. But you're also able to name, you know, others, and it can be completely up to you in terms of what those rater groups look like, but you are able to have up to 5 different rater groups. 20 participants, 5 different rater groups.
Right. And in terms of choosing the participants, you know, a great way to empower, you know, and you just talked about it, you know, there's different ways of going about it, but a great way is getting, you know, empowering the person to draft that first list and then reviewing it with their manager or HR is a great way of keeping that person all, you know, present and involved in all the steps, but at the same time, being able to challenge this person in terms of, I see that you didn't add this person, it could be a great person to add. And always, you know, you mentioned numbers, Jag, and more is not always better in a 360, so that, you know, we're not aiming for necessarily the most raters. You know, obviously we want a good sample size, but we want to choose people that know the person well enough to assess them correctly, right? So that there's no point in adding someone just to get a higher number if that person doesn't have enough frequent interaction to really assess them well on these different competencies. So you do want to choose people that have enough interactions to assess. So next section of the report, top strengths, top opportunities to improve. And here, raters are given a full list of different strengths, opportunities to improve, and then we're asking them to give a weighted score, right? So for the top strengths, you know, give a rating of a weight of 4 on the biggest strengths, then 3, 2, and 1. And here we're seeing, you know, where is their consensus about the biggest strength of the person? And we see, you know, particularly, you know, the top 2 here has strong leadership skill, is visionary and strategic, you know, has 31 and 24 points, and then it goes down to 10, which is still, you know, quite significant. But we have a view of, you know, where there is consensus about top strengths, about top opportunities to improve. So again, it's a great way of not getting lost and bogged down in all the details, but focusing on the salient messages, and they're made clear with this section. The next section is a section that I love, the open-ended comments, because, you know, one of the great things is, you know, being able to give scores and have a ranking and objectify the perceptions, but at the same time, you know, giving an open voice to participants to give comments is a great way of giving feedback to the person. So this is a very rich section in any 360, and obviously the Hogan 360. And finally, there's a section where the person is asked to move from, you know, understanding and interpreting their own results and making sense to them, and then moving forward with an action plan, right? And identifying actions that they, you know, kind of write down and commit to doing in terms of, you know, keep doing, you know, start doing and stop doing, for instance, in this development plan. So this is your generic Hogan 360. Jag will take us into customization, which is also available.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Anica. So, you know, some of the topics that Anica has already covered, there's abilities and areas where we can go ahead and make the or customize the 360 so it's specific for your organization. You know, there's typically 4 different tiers, and we just went through the standard 360. You know, the first tier, which is absolutely at no cost, and we can typically turn around in under a week, actually, is, you know, there's 50 items already included into the 360 based on those 14 leadership competencies, but there's also another item bank of 50 items, and we allow you to add up to another 20 that you select, and it will give you that same type of output that you would have seen, you know, when we first opened up the 360, where we talk about the rank, your score, as well as the global average. We'll go ahead and see those items there. One of the other pieces that's significant about some of the free customization that we do is, you know, things like your own logo on the reports, as well as if you have a minimum of at least three people on any given team completing the 360, we can actually give you an average on the report beside the global average to talk about, you know, how this person not only is their score being interpreted, but again, against how the group average works. And as you continue to kind of work through that process, that group average will continue to change as you add on specific groups if you choose. Anica, if you want to comment anything on the addition of the group, you're good?
No, I think
all right.
all you've yeah, so I think you mentioned it. So you want to get that great group. So, right. You know, 3 is a small number. It makes sense if the team that you're comparing it to is small. If not, you might want to aim for a larger group, obviously, that reflects and that's relevant as a point of comparison.
Right. You know, getting your corporate logos and your branding exercises, those are all items that we can complete with the tier 1 side. You know, when we start kind of going into tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, I'll kind of group them into, you know, anything and everything is possible as long as we're not changing the first 50 questions, because that's where the real validation has been completed. But, things like mapping your corporate values to, what we're looking for in these reports, being able to add additional open-ended questions to that area that Anica loves so much for the comment section. We'll work with you to make sure that those questions are answered, even asked in a manner that's cohesive with what we want to be able to complete in a 360. So there's a wide variety of customizations that are available to you. There is, a small timeline underneath that's available for you to get an idea of how long it takes. But a lot is possible, again, with keeping one thing in mind, that we keep the validity of the tool in place. And we kind of go ahead and work on it from there. I'm happy to take any conversations offline about, further customization, but I'll hand it back over to Anica. Oh, yes, I forgot to kind of mention this part. This is a tool. So when you do have, assessments out and being able to kind of look at the status of what's going on, we're able to take a look at just a brief overview. And this is an overview in terms of how many people have completed, what is the overall completion rate. You can then go over to the subject summary, and the subject summary will tell you who is available or who needs to reply or to the assessment in any group. And then the full detail is who has submitted against the 360 and who hasn't. Typically, when we're, best practices is when we're trying to get the teams motivated to be able to get that final push on the 360s completed, we'll send out group overviews and subject summaries. We'll never really share the full details because we do not want the subject to know who has responded and who hasn't responded, making sure that anonymity stays top of mind. Oh, there's a second slide that talks to all of those specific items. Sorry, go ahead, Anica.
Perfect. Just quickly, just knowing also moving forward, or for those that are already using the Hogan 360, we have some great resources in terms of the Hogan 360 feedback guide, which is really a step-by-step planning tool in terms of every step that you should be following in terms of delivering the feedback. And it's a form that you can use to make sense as you interpret, you go through, because it's a fine balance between making sure that you're ready, you've analyzed it in details, but now you're summarizing and you're focusing on key relevant trends and takeaways. So the feedback guide will help you very much. And there is also a great interpretive guide when using Hogan 360 with the Hogan personality assessments, right? So we're going to talk about when do you want to use the Hogan 360 or a 360 tool versus personality tools. And obviously, I made a reference to if someone's new in the role, this, and you want to have a leadership assessment exercise, a self-awareness exercise in a development context, it might be too early. It would be too early to do it, as they arrive. But doing personality assessments, there's no time frame in terms of how long the person needs to be in that role, or if there's, a contextual crisis going on, the personality assessments might be better. When we want, the Hogan 360 or the 360 in general will be really useful when we want to take a picture of the person at a specific point in time, right? So December 2019, we want a snapshot of, JAG, or a snapshot of leader X, right? And this is really in terms of the perceptions. What are the perceptions at this point in time, and what is the portrait of those perceptions? So again, taking a picture of the mountain, in the fall versus in the winter, right, is that specific time and point. Whereas personality assessments is more something that is looking at what are your core tendencies that tend to be more stable across time, right? So that across time, whether, we're, in the winter or in the summer, obviously our personalities do evolve, but these are more general tendencies, right? So how high is the mountain? How many trees on the mountain, right? So we're getting to more stable elements, right, that are also great for self-awareness, right? So both are great for self-awareness, and they can be done, when done together, they can give great results, because what we do get, the extra perk of combining both at the same time, is that you're really combining, all this information, and you're looking at what are your typical tendencies, right? And then you're seeing, well, right now, you might have this tendency, you might have this derailer, but is it showing through? Are you, successful at managing it? Are we seeing those derailers, for instance, impacting your perception at this point in time? So this is just a snapshot of this tool with the link between the Hogan 360 themes and the different personality assessment scores, right? So that they're giving us typical positive and negative correlations. So as we see integrity, integrity being low, we wouldn't be surprised to have a mischievous derailer, for instance, right? And then we can have a conversation about how this derailer is probably impacting this perception of integrity, right? Same with leisurely, right? Leisurely is all about, saying one thing, but then having private agendas, right? And the need to develop assertiveness in a more transparent way, right? So this is a great way of linking perceptions at this point in time with tendencies that we might have that can explain those perceptions. Very rich. And this tool is great because it gives you, for all the different competencies, the typical correlations, both positive and negative, so that you can help your participant understand their score. Obviously, your participant might not have all these correlations aligned, but they'll help you, this document will help you, understand. So going back to, innovation, right, having the cautious derailer would not be surprising as impacting your innovation score, right? So this great tool, we can make it available for participants that are using the Hogan 360. We'd love to share this with you if you're planning to use both personality and 360 together. So we talked about customization.
Sorry, Anica. Hey, Anica, sorry, quick question. I had a question come in asking about certification. Is this person is Hogan certified today? Do they need to come back for another Hogan certification for the 360?
So what's great about this is that you don't need to come back in person, but there is a webinar or video capsule to go through. So they'll go through, some of the stuff that we looked through in more depth. There are guides that can help you with regards to interpretation. There's even a guide in terms of development activities moving forward, not just interpreting, but what can you propose participants with certain scores. So yes, so you do need to complete a capsule in terms of being ready to make sure that you fully understand the different sections of the report, how everything works, but there is no need to come in person for a training. Jag, do you want to add to this response?
No, that's absolutely perfect. You've covered it all.
Perfect. So just to quickly highlight that there are different versions of the 360 that reflect also certain Hogan reports, right? So that we have the general leadership model with the 14 competencies with the correlations with Hogan, but there's also versions of the Hogan 360 that reflect the leader basis, those 6 dimensions of leadership, the high potential model also, and the agile leader report. So these are also reports that are reflected by Hogan 360. And finally, what's interesting also is that you can generate a team or group report also, right? So that, recently we just assessed a sales team, right? So that you can get, the individual reports, but then you can get also, it's very interesting for the manager of this team, instead of just reading each individual report, being able to see globally what are the trends and what are maybe common strengths that we have, but common development areas that we have, so that we can focus maybe on group development activities and not just one-on-one coaching or development. So that's the team report is also really great to have. Last, we had a few feedback best practices. I won't go through all these best practices. I've summarized, 5 best practices that are always important, regardless of, if it's a Hogan 360. But this is, the slide that you're seeing is directly from the feedback guide, the Hogan 360 feedback guide. And this is the summary page. But it gives you step-by-step best practices so that you feel fully ready. And obviously, we talked about, that training, that online video capsules that you see. Obviously, Jag and myself love to make ourselves available to support you, making sure, recently I had someone, doing feedback for the first time using the Hogan 360. We looked at a couple of them together so that she'd be prepared for her first feedback. So that's something that we can always do for you. And I'll summarize it, just quickly. I talked about how threatening receiving this type of feedback can be, but it can also be a great and powerful experience. So what you want to do is make sure that you're building rapport, you're making links with notions such as growth mindset, so that you're really bringing, setting the table in a very constructive, non-threatening way. And then link with context, right? There's a lot of information in any 360 report. So what you want to do is focus on what's most relevant for the context, what scores are most salient. And, one of my next best practice in feedback is engaging the person and asking questions. And a question that we tend to ask a lot when we go through 360 results is, what takeaways do you see? What are the patterns that you're seeing, right? As you look at, your top scores, and you're asking a lot of questions about patterns and trends emerging from the results. And finally, obviously you want to conclude on action steps, right? So that, like I said, this is just a tool that will set someone in motion in terms of taking actions that will help them develop their leadership. So that would lead us to your questions and any takeaways that people want to ask about.
Anica, I've got one question that's come in, and they're asking, what if the person doesn't recognize themselves in the feedback?
Right. Well, the great thing about a 360 tool, right, like I said, is about perceptions, right? And I'm always very clear to participants that, today we'll look at your 360 results. We'll, and I mentioned the different rater groups, and I emphasize about how this is all about perceptions, right? And we'll see often that one group might have very strong perceptions versus another group that has, perceptions that are very different, right? So that, we're looking at perceptions. So the reality, who the real you is, is not what we're focusing or we're debating on. We're looking at how people are perceiving you at this point in time. So that if you don't recognize yourself, on this score, what I'd be doing with the participant is exploring, I wouldn't be challenging, well, this is, who they're saying you are. We're in perception. So I'm not having this this debate with the person, but instead I'd engage them in, well, you know yourself, and this is something that appears, to be something important to you. What could you be doing more? What could you be doing differently so that people see this more, see this side of you, so that they can perceive this, right? So that you can, what could you do that would change this perception to show this side of you that, you strongly believe that is present, right? So that's what I'd focus on, more what they can do to show and change perceptions versus challenging the perceptions.
All right, great, thank you. Again, if anybody has any questions, they can just go to the Q&A tab below, and they come directly to me. Another question around challenging feedback. What has been your most challenging feedback? Generally, I would say one comes to mind particularly as particularly challenging. I think, one key thing that I do that allows me to have less challenging feedback is really that, non-threatening approach. So I think, approaching the feedback in a non-threatening way
and a constructive, the growth mindset I keep on repeating, allows you to, have a lot of success with this. But I remember particularly one feedback that I gave where, sometimes it could be a very strong reality check as opposed to a personality assessment where, the person answered, they might disagree with the results sometimes, mostly they agree with most, but, it's a little bit less personal in terms of, this is not my colleagues or, my boss saying that I'm not doing such a good job on this dimension, right? So that it hits home a little bit more. It's people in your day-to-day environment rating you. So I think it hits home a little bit more. So I remember particularly one person that had more trouble accepting, and it's not so much that they disagreed with the feedback, but that it was just very hard to accept. And it was amazing how just sometimes giving time to the person, right, where we kind of decided to, obviously I set the table with the constructive and the growth mindset again, but I just kind of left it with, how about, you take some time, reread this, and go through this and let's meet again, and I think we probably met, a week later, and just having some time to sit with the results sometimes is what the participants need, right? And I've had, other people talking to me about how, it took them, 6 months to accept, a feedback, right? But finally they did, right? So sometimes it's just allowing that time to settle in. The 6 months part also, there's one author that suggests that the fact of just popping and putting a reminder to reread your 360 and, after 6 months allows you to have more return on investment from your 360, right? So that's another best practice, just, putting, reminding people after a few months to go back to their 360, reread them, and maybe, identify new actions that they want to do in line with this. But I would say that one hard one was the person accepting the results, and time was key in terms of that. So, not feeling that you have to resolve everything, but sometimes just giving room to let the person accept their feedback, and then moving them into action steps in terms of what they want to do with this.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This webinar was being recorded and will be available to you. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, I will send everybody an email, or they will receive an email from our team in regards to getting a copy of the presentation and so on and so forth. Again, thank you very much for attending. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much. Have a great day.